the status quo is not sustainable because the status quo has no insight into the true nature of Iran's nuclear program. We can presume it's been delayed and degraded and disrupted. Those are military tasks. I think it's less certain that it's been destroyed, and it certainly still exists in some form. But the only way to verify the extent of it, and then, God willing, to verify the end of a nuclear weapons program, is either through a diplomatic solution or significant escalation in violence to militarily determine the state of the nuclear program. That dichotomy, that kind of fork in the road, is still here. And I think it's perhaps now more likely that diplomacy will be the path taken, but we still have to start down the road, land the plane, whatever analogy you want to use.
Thank you so much for tuning into the Signal Sit Down. But before we get to the interview, we'd love it if you'd hit that like and subscribe button on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you may be joining us. And please remember to give us a 5-star review because we love your feedback. Remember, it's your government, and together we'll expose how it really works and how to affect real change. Without further ado, here's the interview. Will Thibeau, welcome to the Signal Sit Down.
Thanks, Bradley. Good to see you.
Of course, good seeing you as well. As I've gotten older, people always ask me, you used to kind of be a neocon. What happened to you? And I said, well, I grew up and I kind of realized how bad war is. And I have no desire to go to war. I have no experience in war. And I can't help but notice that a lot of people advocating for war have no such experience. That's not you. You have been to war. You were an Army Ranger. First, let's just start there. What is war like, actually?
Well, it's something that many others are better postured to speak on than myself, but it is, I describe it as the most amount of fun that you can have in life that you never want to do again. Because it's this exhilarating moment, frankly, when you're in the Army. It's all you hope for. When you're in I was in, I think, the best unit in the military, the 75th Range Regiment. And guys literally prayed to be able to deploy and see combat. I think that was part of the reality of fighting in Iraq for me, at least. It was low intensity combat, perhaps not a full appreciation for what war in the 21st century might look like. Certainly not what war looks like in Ukraine, let's say, right now. But it is this drug that you can't kick and you can't live without experiencing. But, with some years and with children now, for me, it is the last thing you want to happen. It is a measure of last resort for the nation. Again, for, people whom I love still in the Army. But I will never forget what it was like. I'll never forget wanting it, lusting for it as much as I did when I was in the Army. And it's this really kind of brutal juxtaposition between something that I used to dream of and then, something I want to do everything to make sure that the nation does not wage unless it is absolutely necessary.
So what do you think of middle-aged magazine editors who have never been to war feeling that lust probably more than they ever have in the last 15 years? In the last 2 weeks, they've really felt that. What do you think of when you see these people on Twitter?
Yeah, I'll definitely temper my comments. This is frankly, it's not just for the middle-aged magazine editor. It's for the 26-year-old Hill staffer. A lot of us had the chance to join the military. And, I joined because, and I will get to your question, but I joined because we were a nation at war. I joined the Army. I had years of training ahead of me before I deployed, but I joined the Army in 2010. I think we were winding down or had just left Iraq, but Afghanistan was still cooking.
ISIS was about to come.
ISIS was laying in wait. And there were still soldiers, American men and women, dying every day. Perhaps not every day, but a lot. And to my mind, if the nation is at such a place where Americans are dying literally around the world, then there is nothing better than I can do but be with them and to try and serve in the same way. Because I remember thinking this as a 17-year-old, that if I were ever going to have an opinion on how our military is used for the rest of my life, even not seeing this, very DC-centric life I live now, but even just as a voter, if I ever wanted to have an opinion, then I have been willing to put my neck on the line when it counted. And again, the stakes were small for me. The combat I saw was pretty minuscule compared to so many, even compared to those who deployed earlier in the war in Iraq. But at the end of the day, I wanted to show myself and my kids that when our nation was at war, whatever you think of the war, I was willing to serve. And, there are some, not everyone did that, which is fine. I don't begrudge them, but I do think war has become this video game for the nation. It's become a sporting event in some ways, where you can observe the effects on the internet and the news. You see statistics like ground covered or casualties or number of bombs dropped. And that is very different from the real visceral experience of having that happen to you in real life and having to face the consequences of it. And it's not about the soldiers who served or the airmen who fly bomber jets. It's about the Gold Star family. I had a boss who would always say that we being the Rangers with whom I served, we have the easy job. We get to fulfill our life's mission by deploying overseas, jumping out of airplanes, and doing things that we will never forget. But it's the families who spend every waking minute of a deployment in abject misery and stress. Children, mothers, fathers, husbands, and wives. And that is, to me, that's the cost of war. Mm-hmm. And even if I don't necessarily expect everyone to serve, I think you should at least have an understanding of what it's like to either have served yourself or to have known someone you deeply love deploy and fight in a war, because that's misery in of itself.
The sport metaphor is especially good, I think, especially as we've seen the last 2 weeks. I mean, no matter what news channel you turn on, there's literally TV screens with the X's and O's of bunker busters and B-2s. And, my wife and I have said in jest, returning home from work after a long day, hey, let's turn on the war. Let's turn on the game, and people watch it like it's a sporting event. Like, Israel has the ball and they've just launched a few missiles. Turnover on downs. Iran now has the ball. They're driving to the goal line. There is I'm not the first to make the nationalism sports to, country metaphor. It's why we love the Olympics, blah, blah, blah. But there is something, sport is supposed to be war in miniature in a lot of ways. And when you actually get war in major, war in a grand scale, there is that same type of emotion that instantly bubbles to the top. But, maybe I was uncharitable to the middle-aged magazine editor, but, these people have no intention of going to war. They have no intention of sending their kids to war. Now, some of them, a lot of young men and women who have risen up and valiantly defended their own countries, whether that's in Ukraine, right? Ukrainians. I have no ill will towards those people. I have no ill will towards American or Israeli Jews going and joining the IDF after their country was attacked on October 7th. I think that's incredibly honorable and fantastic, actually. That's beautiful. I think there's a quote from General Lee that says, "It's a shame that war is so beautiful because we've grown too fond of it." And that's a paraphrase from the Civil War. But you mentioned it, last 20 years, war has kind of become this video game for the American people. And now, we'll talk about the ceasefire in a second, but we're in this weird interstitial space where this conflict could go a number of different directions. From inside the military community and the veterans that you talk to, the veterans of the war on terror in particular, I mean, how do they see this current conflict? Are they more skeptical after the wars on terror?
Many are still eager to fight, I think. And if you were to map the active duty infantrymen onto a hawkish realist nexus, I think they're probably towards the hawkish trend or the hawkish side.
Which is no surprise.
No, it's not.
Yeah.
And the other kind of frustration I have in these debates is we treat the decision of going to war and kind of the nature of evaluating the American interest like not a video game, but a game of risk. You know, my team takes territory from the other team. We have more of it. We have more people in more places. So therefore we win because the scoreboard says so. And that was kind of the rhythm of these last 2 weeks between Israel and Iran. Israel fires missiles, drops bombs. Iran returns with missiles and bombs. And now it's Israel's turn again. But I think the men, especially on the front lines, they're eager and itching all the time. And I think you need them to be, to some extent. They should be, because their job is to do violence deliberately, which is perhaps simply said, but perhaps compelling when you unpack it. Most of the military, 9 out of 10 soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, their job is not intentional violence. It's perhaps a supporting function, supply, intelligence, cyber operations, and even for combat operations, it is in support, where you might launch artillery or you might be on a presence patrol, but your job is not to go to where you know the enemy is and engage in an exchange of gunfire or other munitions in order to kill the enemy before he kills you. That's a very small subset of the military. Those guys, I'd like to think I served with many of them and perhaps was one of them. They're always ready, always willing, always perhaps desperate to do that job. And we should be, again, the job, I think, of the president, I thought of this as my job even as a platoon leader, was to kind of hold dogs on leash, hunting dogs who are desperate, ready for the hunt, but you have to moderate their impulse and ensure that you only let them off leash when you know there's a good target that's worth your time and sight. And that's, by extension, I think, the job of the commander-in-chief, Secretary of Defense, and the combatant commanders. But it's not the job to just let them off leash once you get into the woods.
That's a fascinating way of putting it, and the war dogs will hunt, I guess.
That's right.
And this is what the president has done. I mean, he's been pulling on those leashes, or giving our military a little bit more leash to act in the Middle East. Right now, it's Tuesday morning as we're recording this, so we are coming off of a very busy night and a very busy day yesterday. So yesterday, President Trump announces that there is some sort of ceasefire in the works between Iran and Israel. Shortly after that ceasefire was announced, there were conflicting statements from both the Israeli government and the Iranian government. There were continued exchanges into the early morning Middle Eastern time, Israel targeting a radar installation, and then Iran firing back a salvo that lasted beyond the 4 a.m. kind of cutoff. It started before, and then it lasted for about 2 hours, I believe, into the early morning hours in Tehran and Israel. The president did not seem happy this morning. He dropped an F-bomb, which is hopefully the only bombs that anyone's going to be dropping after the ceasefire is made official. But he did not seem happy with either the Israelis or the Iranians after the announcement of this ceasefire. What did you make of the last 24 hours of events? Where do you think things could potentially go from here?
Where you indicated the president's head is, I think, is still the most important consideration for the conflict. It is clear and I'm not even talking kind of I'm not even talking in the phrase of like a conspiracy, but if President Trump permits what happens in the Middle East, I think it is still very much a question of what pressure he wants to exact on the Iranians and the Israelis in order for them to get to a ceasefire. For these kind of this early morning exchange of attacks, I think it could be attributed at least by the Iranians in a degraded communications environment to, operational friction. If there's as much confusion for their public messaging, there's probably a lot of confusion for both them and the Israelis, from the Ayatollah to the IRGC chain of command to the battery commander of whatever, rocket battery or the ballistic missile launcher, the guy who's pressing the button. So I do think if both parties want a ceasefire, and I think a ceasefire is in the rational interest, at least in the near term, for both Israel and Iran, then it's clearly right on the table to take. Even if some violence, deliberately proceeds for the coming days, I do think this initial burst of tension is waning, and there's going to be increasing pressure from America specifically to set the conditions to find out what happens next, which I think is still the key question.
You were one of the first people I called when I figured out that the United States had gone through with the B-2 bombers hitting Thibeau, and then, of course, there were Tomahawk missiles that hit other nuclear sites in Iran. Of course, you take 3 hours to yourself on a Sunday afternoon to get a twilight tea time, and of course, you check your phone after things are done, and boom, there it is.
That's right.
Which, I should have anticipated that something like that would pop off on a Saturday night, because it's a very, convenient time for it to happen. The Sunday shows are tomorrow. A lot of the American people are out living their lives, spending time with their families on a Saturday night. That's not to say that it was any sort of deception or misdirection. It's just, where can you operate? Where are you given the most kind of space to operate in a time like that, when the American people are attending to things of family and things of community tends to be a better time to do it. Point being, though, this B-2 mission, when you and I hopped on the phone, one of the things we were saying is, a silver lining here could be, hey, this has all been back-channeled between Tel Aviv and Tehran, saying, we're going to go forward with this strike. We believe it's a priority to deny nuclear capabilities to the Iranians. So we're going to go forward with this. Tehran, be very careful how you respond, because at the same time, we're coordinating with Israel to make sure that Israel is not going forward with any more, massive strikes on your nuclear scientists, or taking out just another general in your command, and keeping that constant churn in the regime, which weakens it. And so, this can be the beginning of the end of this 12-day war. And it seems like there was indications in that direction. I don't know how this latest missile salvo between the Iranians and the Israelis really undermine or undercut that. The president didn't seem particularly happy, of course, as we've said. But nevertheless, here we sit. It was a pretty major operation. You know exactly what it would have taken to drop those bunker busters. Any sort of future engagements that we should be wary about in the near future here?
Well, I guess just one observation. It was, to me, if I have a criticism for perhaps some of our friends and those with whom we share some, predispositions about the nature of conflict and exercising military force, I think it was always Pollyannish to assume that President Trump wouldn't take military action, or that it was off the table. To me, it was clear, if you kind of just put the dots together, much less classified intelligence assessments if you're on the inside, that there was some predicate, some precedent for action. And I honestly think it was kind of the perfect timing, right, with this 2-week announcement. Within 2 weeks, Seymour Hersh, a troublingly well-sourced journalist, had a Substack post, I think Thursday night, saying it would start over the weekend. So as much as perhaps folks wished for a different outcome, it was on the table. But I think if you pay attention to what happened since, you can perhaps see the justification for what President Trump ordered. Expectedly, Iran launched missiles at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. This was after the U.S. had vacated with at least many of the planes that were not permanently but persistently stationed there. And so it does look like there are some telegraphed messages at some point to ensure that this was not seen.
Seems like the Qataris were tipped off.
Right. Yeah, at the very least. And I think President Trump and perhaps the Iranian political leadership know that there's a certain response necessary to send a message to your domestic audience as well as to your international audience, and that's where it's come to. But in my mind, this I did a few media appearances early last week before the U.S. strikes. It still brings us to the same point. The status quo is not sustainable because the status quo has no insight into the true nature of Iran's nuclear program. We can presume it's been delayed and degraded and disrupted. Those are military tasks. I think it's less certain that it's been destroyed, and it certainly still exists in some form. But the only way to verify the extent of it, and then God willing, to verify the end of a nuclear weapons program is either through a diplomatic solution or significant escalation in violence to militarily determine the state of the nuclear program. That dichotomy, that kind of fork in the road is still here. And I think it's perhaps now more likely that diplomacy will be the path taken, but we still have to start down the road, land the plane, whatever analogy you want to use.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a massively important point, that this ceasefire is now a intermediate step to a probably broader diplomatic solution underneath the ceasefire, and how long that those negotiations will go on for, the product of those negotiations, all of this still very much left up in the air. And the consequences of this American action with the B-2s, this last 12 days of war, that is going to be an arc written in decades. It is not going to be something that I think everyone's out over their skis right now about everything, every talking point, way out over our skis. We're going to have to be deliberate in evaluating step by step the consequences of American military action, of Iranian military action, of Israeli military action. For quite some time, right? Does this push things underground? Does this make diplomacy more likely? What type of deal are we going to get because of it? What are the Gulf states going to be thinking for the next several years? Is Abraham Accords 2.0 more likely or less likely now? These are all questions that we have to grapple with in the region, and then you extend it outside of the region. What is our non-proliferation agreements going to look like with Russia potentially, or with China? Because I know that there's some sort of diplomatic appetite to do stuff with respect to nuclear weapons with Iran, or with Russia, and with China, as well, as we kind of try to pivot away from the Middle East and Europe, because there's now more appetite from the Europeans to increase their defense spending. But I guess that brings us to the pivot, right? If we want to pivot away from the Middle East, there's been a lot of talk of pivoting to Asia. There's also been a lot of talk of using President Trump's using the military to accomplish President Trump's domestic agenda, vis-a-vis immigration, for example. So let's start with pivoting to China. How does that actually get done? We've been talking about it for a decade. Trump had some success in his first term with accomplishing that. And then, of course, the war in Ukraine broke out. The war in Israel broke out during Biden's tenure. And now you kind of have to start from scratch all over again.
You need an Iran deal. I mean, it's clear that the Iranian nuclear program is going to be a sticking point. Perhaps that holds us back from a refocus on the Pacific if we let it continue to be. There was some indication before the war kicked off that Iran was open to much lower enrichment thresholds, JCPOA levels, and importantly, the presence of American inspectors to validate as much, which was a key omission, I think, in many folks' minds from the Obama JCPOA. So I think Trump wants a better deal than Obama got, and we should get that because, again, there has to be a framework for validating the absence of Iranian nuclear weapons. The framework will either be diplomacy or war. It needs to be diplomacy so we can pivot elsewhere. I'm not convinced that a complete kind of wholesale departure from Europe makes sense. I am in favor of as fast of an end to the war in Ukraine as possible. But I think Europe, as we saw, provides important strategic value that can help us with China. But I think this B-2 strike is an important kind of lens through which to view the dilemma of the future. The B-2 bombers, I think it was 7 B-2s, and we only have 2, maybe 3 dozen B-2s in the inventory. There was one point where during the Biden administration, we had less than 5 operational B-2s because of maintenance shortfalls, some other things. But it was a significant use of the B-2 fleet. Again, this is the actual number is classified and I don't know it. We used a third, maybe a quarter of our bunker buster inventory. We didn't have many. We maybe had 20 or 30, and we used 7 to 9, reportedly. And so this is a significant action. A whole host of aircraft involved, submarines and other naval ships. We have to understand what the allocation of power looks like in the Pacific, right? Because we're not going to have the luxury of being able to concentrate so many forces, so much combat power at even just 3 locations and have the parallel kind of effect on the Chinese nuclear force, let's say, or their military writ large.
Yeah, I mean, we just look at how we've shifted resources in the region over the past 2 weeks. I mean, there's been some very telling graphics on Fox News, for example, where they show you the maps of all the ships in the region, show you the maps of all the different air bases there or military installations, right? Some of these installations much more vulnerable than others, right? For example, in Syria, much more vulnerable than some of the bases in Iraq because of different missile installations, right? Some of them have THAAD or Patriot missile batteries, I believe, whereas the ones in Syria really don't. And so you kind of look at this, it's like, wow, that seems like a nation that is really trying to project power in this specific region. And when you're moving the Nimitz group into the region, you think to yourself, what does that actually look like in Asia, right? And of course we have many bases in Asia, but that military presence in the Middle East very clearly pulls our attention away, our resources away from the America's number one geopolitical threat, which is a rising China.
Yeah, and I don't say this to say it wasn't worth it. Perhaps it was the right thing to do, but there's also
it just makes the trade-off clear.
Well, and so my point is, I think we might be able to get away with the trade-off in 2025. I don't know if we're going to be able to get away with the trade-off in 2026 or 2027. The math of how you array combat power in the Pacific in a way that doesn't preempt the Chinese threat on Taiwan is a really hard problem and really sticky. And we're going to have to be really scrutinous about how we expend combat power. And this goes to kind of the question of what our military needs to look like in order not just to reallocate focus and resources away from the Pacific and Europe, or away from the Middle East and Europe to the Pacific, but to then present a credible deterrent to China. While we will always need exquisite systems like nuclear submarines and B-2 bombers, the lessons of the war in Ukraine show us that the defining, I think, strategic, operational, and tactical weapon systems are cheap, attritable, unmanned drones that are causing 80% of the casualties on both sides of the front lines and have redefined the defense industrial bases of both Ukraine and Russia. To my mind, if we're serious about giving Taiwan the ability to defeat China without, again, preempting the threat with U.S. conventional military forces, it often goes to the question of how they can adapt and use unmanned systems. And so I think there's a way that innovation and investment in this kind of less sexy and less profitable for the defense industrial base, modes of product development can actually be a way for us to match the threat can facilitate our focus away from the Middle East and Europe, but we have to actually do it. Deterrence will look a lot different in the Pacific than it will in the Middle East. It's going to be I don't know that you fly a fleet of B-2s halfway around the world into uncontested enemy airspace if that enemy is China, right? And so we can't assume that what has worked in the Middle East tactically for the last 25 years will also work in the Pacific, because the geography is fundamentally different and the threat is that much more sophisticated from the Chinese in particular, and even the North Koreans.
Yeah, the drones just don't look as cool as the B-2s, which is a shame. Maybe we can make the drones miniature B-2s, and then maybe people will be more on board for it.
That's right.
But yeah, I mean, your point about Taiwan is well taken, because they've gotten more serious about this in recent years, and they deserve to be applauded, though the Taiwanese defense expenditures need to keep going up and up and up. But, back in years past, Taiwan would be like, give us military aid, give us tanks. And it's like, no, you don't need a tank. It's like a mountainous island. Like, you need javelins, you need drones, you need all of these little tiny mobile pieces of equipment that can stave off an amphibious invasion if that's the way that China goes about it. And that brings us to the broader modernization point. Pete Hegseth was brought into the Pentagon to be a mover and shaker, to reinvigorate the warfighter mentality. And at the same time, this golden age of America that President Trump wants to usher in is going to be built on modernization in a few specific areas. That is manifesting now in the big, beautiful reconciliation package bill. Of course, appropriations is probably going to see an increase in defense expenditures too. With that $150 to $200 billion that the military is going to be getting through budget reconciliation, and the other monies that I'm sure Republicans will provide the military in the next 4 years, what are our main objectives to make sure that we modernize our military, that we keep out-innovating our adversaries?
I'll pay attention and I'll be impressed when I see scale from the defense industrial base. Let's stick with the drone argument. Ukraine and Russia, and Ukraine does this basically out of garages, both build 40,000 first-person view drones per month, and they use them all. Ukraine and Russia both will build about 2.5 million. They project 2.5 million for this year. China themselves, 1 million first-person view drones in 2025 alone. That is a stockpile of munitions and weapons that will be transformative in a future conflict. I don't think the American military, in aggregate, in its history, has ever had more than 5,000 FPV drones, ever. I think even 2,500 is probably a more realistic number. So there is a point we can't expect, the defense industrial base and our military to surge investment manufacturing capability once the shooting starts. We have to figure this out, as I call it, left of bang in many ways, before we have to learn lessons the hard way. And if we're going to get all this money, which I think is necessary, but I think the more important kind of mindset shift is a cultural one. Contracting officers need to be more comfortable with awarding startups and innovative companies who know that a new way of doing business is required, right? There are going to be no long services contracts for maintenance on a first-person view drone, but you still need eventually millions of them. And so that's the incentive the DoD needs to provide to the private sector, so that the muscles can be developed to meet the needs of future conflict, to deter future conflict. If the U.S., covertly or otherwise, is able to provide Taiwan with a stockpile of a few 100,000 first-person view drones that can be turned into bombs and flown into Chinese vessels, that's an incredible deterrent. That's what turning Taiwan into a porcupine looks like. My frustration with the whole discussion about that potential conflict is that our only, maxim through which we view it is, oh, how soon can we fly planes or, drive boats into missile range of the Chinese in order for them to meet near certain death. I don't think we should accept that. And I think we need to think of other ways that our investment can actually, be meaningful to prevent war. And then if necessary, actually make it a quick one.
So you mentioned they've got to get more comfortable giving these contracts to startups. I think one of the big sticking points, Doge. We talked a lot about Doge for a long time. Now we don't talk about it nearly as much, but Doge is still going to have its teams are in place all across the administration, working hand in hand with these cabinet secretaries. There's going to be second and third order knock-on effects from the Doge effort, finding waste, fraud, and abuse. They found a lot of waste, fraud, and abuse in the State Department / soft power apparatus. USAID comes to mind. The government-funded think tanks come to mind. We haven't really fully started that process. I know Secretary Hegseth has eliminated some contracts, has eliminated a lot of costly DEI training policies and all this type of nonsense. But nevertheless, Pentagon hasn't passed an audit in its history. We spend upwards of $800 billion per year on the military. As we talk about modernization, of course, we need to make sure that we have the requisite resources there. But how do you think we should go about making those resources more efficient? How can we make sure that the American taxpayer dollar going to the legitimate defense of the nation, right? There's very few things that I think taxpayer dollars have a legitimate purpose for. And defending the nation is certainly one of them. How do we make sure that the American dollar goes farther in our military spending?
There are a few things. I think the Pentagon controls too much of the big program of record money. And when I say the Pentagon, I mean the building in Arlington, Virginia. And we need to ensure that folks in the combatant commands, in other words, those military organizations who will actually fight a war, CENTCOM as one example, INDOPACOM as the other example, I think they should have a lot more money and purchasing power in order to bring on programs of record that they see fit. There is way too much kind of top cover that we think is helpful, but in actuality just creates distance between the operator who uses a drone and the person who actually chooses what drone to buy. I think we got to fix that to some extent. One example, there's something called CMMC 2.0. It's kind of an arcane example, but it's new requirements coming on at the end of the year that will require all entities, private companies receiving a defense contract to have an elevated standard of cybersecurity compliance in order to be awarded a contract. Now, I'm all for cybersecurity and having good passwords and stuff, but and this is kind of a minimum cost, when a startup has to spend $150,000 to be CMMC compliant, to pass a third-party audit, to buy a certain kind of laptop, with all the appropriate infrastructure, just in the event that they might handle an unclassified government document. I think that creates a barrier to entry that only established bigger defense companies can pass. And so that's a Biden era policy that so far the Trump administration is continuing, that will create friction with the desire to be innovative and to ensure that the next generation of innovative defense companies can contribute to national security. Another one is the DIU, the Defense Innovation Unit. They have a blue list that validates if you build your products without Chinese components. It's a good thing and a great concept, but in many ways that creates an additional layer of compliance that, again, it's the young companies that are most affected by. So they have to prove that they follow the law, but then they have to kind of earn the badge that proves and shows that you follow the law. And then and only then can you sell into most DoD units.
So like in every industry we have in this country, red tape make red line for Raytheon go up.
Well, exactly. And so Raytheon has no problem building an entire compliance department with hundreds of people that ensures that they make this happen. But for a company that wants to build a software plugin that really helps with artificial intelligence targeting, that's their IP. The only way they can compete is if they sell out to a Raytheon or to a BAE. And that creates a lot of problems. So there are some things that I think the Pentagon can still kind of push towards. It is the right mindset, and it's important to note the Biden Pentagon would never make this kind of change. It's this seamless fabric that I think flows from a Pentagon filled with race quotas for every civilian and soldier alike, and a Pentagon that only awards contracts to established boxy defense primes and kind of really hampers innovation. It's this sclerotic fear of kind of change and excellence as I see it. And so I'm grateful the Trump administration is making some changes here, but we just got to keep our foot on the gas.
Yeah, and at the same time, there's a lot of conversations about, what does deterrence look like around the world? Sure, but what does deterrence look like here at home? Of course, China's been encroaching on the Western Hemisphere. There has been talks about having the military make sure that we are defending our borders. There has been talks about military, of course, installations in Greenland, and maybe we should just buy the whole dang thing. Going forward, we saw the violence in Los Angeles, absolute chaos. I know people want to downplay it. Well, no, not all of Los Angeles was burning. Yeah, like Los Angeles is like 100 square miles. Not all of it needs to be burning for some pretty terrible stuff to be going on. Your mostly peaceful line isn't working with the American people anymore, mainstream media. I'm sorry, we all lived through the summer of love in 2020, and we know what you mean when you say that, which means, we're winking and nodding at riots. There was talk about bringing in the military for that, obviously talking about bringing the military to the border. What can the president actually do with the military to achieve his domestic agenda goals? And how should he be using it?
A lot. And I think he should use it more freely in our direct sphere of influence within our borders. There's so much waxing poetically on mainstream media outlets about the oath that an Army officer or a Navy officer takes to the Constitution, but in that same oath, you pledge your service to confront both enemies, foreign and domestic. And so why not? Right? What better use of our military than the safety and security of our homeland, the preservation of our borders, and where civil authorities fail, the peace and the viability of our cities, which are the lifeblood of our country. Back to you asked a question of kind of how I think this would require a mindset shift, especially in the units in which I served. And perhaps, I don't think necessarily the Ranger Regiment's the best suited for downtown LA right now. But, there does need to be a mindset shift for the service members in the military that, hey, this is a well and just use of your time and service because you are serving your people. I'm no legal scholar, but to my mind, the president serves the American people. And if you, like I did in the summer of 2020, walking in Washington, D.C., push my stroller with my child through broken glass with burned out buildings next to us, then that is a failure of government, local, state, and federal. And it shouldn't get to that point ever again. I think President Trump knows that, and he's going to use the resources at his disposal, which include the military.
And using those resources at the border in particular, that means you could free up more deportation capacity with respect to other elements of, Border Patrol, ICE, et cetera. I mean, what function, trying to figure out exactly what type of function it would be, I guess. What type of support function would the military provide at the southern border that could lead to higher levels of deportation? Are they helping in the processing? Are they making sure that, people just aren't coming in and applying for asylum in the first place, or directing these people, if they do want asylum, to the correct port of entry? We're not doing catch and release anymore, all that type of stuff. Is that the support function? Does it free up resources for immigration enforcement to increase the deportation levels, or is it to just keep a seal on that southern border that's already seen, crossings drop 99%?
Yeah, I think the seal is the most important thing the military can provide, just because the resources they have is unmatched. I see the military as the important function of keeping the border closed and then establishing a buffer zone into Mexico or Canada with information dominance that provides security and predictability. So Customs and Border Patrol, DHS, ICE have more leeway and bandwidth to spend time on internal enforcement and deportation. Honestly, I think the military can probably do a lot with good technology, and there's a way to build in a deployment schedule that enhances their operational readiness for other missions that are perhaps, more familiar with the American people. But I want the military to have kind of from the border, to a few dozen miles into foreign territory that borders us. I want the military to have complete information dominance over this buffer zone. And if necessary, conduct operations that can eliminate threats, provide for security, and prevent the kind of toxic chaos of mass migration from ever getting into our country in the first place. If we know that there's a chain, what do they call these things during the Biden administration? But like these these
caravans.
The caravans of people we know coming up through Mexico. Why not go and stop it? Right? There's a lot of good evidence on the other side that the fentanyl traffic is rerouting north through Canada. Being a sovereign nation means preventing a problem from getting to your people. And so if the Canadians are not going to take the appropriate steps to, interdict smuggling lines, from the Pacific Northwest in and down through the northern border, then we should shut those off, and that should be the military that goes to do that. It's also a way to keep young soldiers motivated. I can tell you that much.
As you look to the next few years, when Trump leaves office in 2028, the golden age hopefully will have arrived. At least every American should be praying for that, I think. A golden age sounds pretty good to me after this kind of managed decline of the last 4 decades. From the perspective of the military, what would you say is a success in 2028 when we elect a new president and when President Trump leaves in 2029?
So personally, I'll think it's a success if I want my sons to serve in the military of 2028, 2029. And that goes to, a genuine kind of codified end to an ideology of diversity, equity, and inclusion that has kind of seized the military, I think, since 1965. But it also means an appreciation in this town for what purpose the military serves, not as a police force of neoconservatism and foreign interests, but a genuine, body of the application of lethal violence that serves the American people and makes the American way of life more attainable, fruitful, and accessible for our people. I want our military to be used well. And that, I think, is an under-discussed, trend of the last few decades, is the American people lost confidence in military leaders. The American Principles Project did a great survey on this a few years ago. And I think a lot of that loss in confidence is in how the military was employed, not just in the pride parades and race quotas, which are problematic, but in the sense that if I sent my son to the military, he might not be laying his life on the line for a good enough reason. And I want to have the confidence that my sons can serve like I did. I want them to get the benefits that I got from serving in the Army. but with full confidence that I can have a higher degree, higher trust that their sacrifice and their service would be respected by people who want it to be used for good. That's what I'll be paying attention to, and I think there are going to be a lot of trends in the demographics of who's joining the military that can indicate if other people are listening, because those were the demographics that stopped serving during the Biden administration.
Will Thibeau, thank you so much for coming on the Signal Sit Down.
Thanks, Bradley.
Thank you so much for tuning into the Signal Sit Down. Before you go, be sure to hit like and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you may be joining us. And please remember to give us a 5-star review. We not only love your feedback, but it really does help the show. Remember, it's your government, and together we'll expose how it really works. See you next time.